Good afternoon, everyone. I just want to check to see if you can hear me. Brad, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Jewel.
All righty. Thank you so much. Good afternoon. This is Jewel Bernal, VDAC's commissioner, and I just want to join my co-chair, Mr. Travis Hill, in welcoming everyone to the Virginia Marijuana Legalization subgroup meeting, the Fiscal and Structural Subgroup meeting 2 today. Before we get started, I think we first need to take roll and do a roll call. So I will ask Brad if he will go ahead and start the roll call, and then we can move forward with the agenda today.
All right. Thanks, Jewel. So I'm just going to go down the list, and if there are any other work group members that are that I don't call and you're also present, we'll do that at the end. But first, Jen Michelle Padini from Normal.
Here.
Jewel Bernal.
Here.
Kristen Collins or Joe Mayer from Tax. Okay. Nagista Bebe from Columbia Care.
Present.
Nate Green. David Brown.
David Barron is here.
Hey, David. I saw Joe Mayer. Joe, are you there?
Yeah, this is Joe Mayer.
Oh,
Sorry,
okay. And I see Kristen.
Too.
I see Kristen too. I'm going to try to get her unmuted. Hold on. I'll unmute you, Kristen. I'll find that and unmute you. Mike McKenzie cannot make it today. He let me know. Michael Carter.
I'm here.
Colby Ferguson. Travis Hill.
Travis Hill is glad to be here.
Hey, Travis. And then Linda Jackson or anyone else from DFS? Or David?
Yeah, David Barron's here from DFS.
Hey, David. And then Richard Boyd or John Welch from State Police. Okay. Secretary Moran.
I'm on, Brad. Good afternoon.
Hi, Mr. Secretary. Joe Flores from Secretary Lane's office. Thought I saw Joe. And then Katie Finley from Secretary Carey's office.
I'm here.
All right, and that's our roll. Thanks, Joel. We have a quorum to operate.
All righty, very good. So seeing as we have a quorum, our next order of business is to review and approve the minutes. And Brad sent the minutes out to us, I think earlier today, this morning. And so unfortunately for record, we have to individually show our approval of the minutes. So Brad, I'm going to ask you to go through the roll again. And if you approve the minutes, please state by saying aye or yes.
All right. Thanks, Jewel. All right. We're going to do this quickly because our first speaker is on now. So Jen Michelle Padini.
Approve.
Jewel Bernal.
Approve.
Kristen Collins.
Approve.
Nagista Bebe.
Approve.
David Brown. Michael Carter.
Approve.
Okay. Did I hear you too, David?
If that's David Barron, not David Brown, yes.
Oh, sorry, David. So David Brown, and then also David Barron.
I'm not David Brown. I'm David Barron.
Okay, got it. Thank you. Travis Hill.
Yes.
Secretary Moran. Joe Flores. Katie Finley.
Approve.
All right, great. Thank you. And I'll turn it over to you, Jewel, to introduce our first guest speaker today.
All righty. Thank you, Brad. We'll move forward with the agenda and following up with our responsibility of reaching out to more resources and learning about what other states are doing. We're very fortunate to have Mr. Steve Hoffman here with us from the Massachusetts Cannabis Control Commission. He is the chairman, and that commission is responsible for safely, equitably, and effectively implementing and administering the laws enabling access to medical and adult use marijuana in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So I would like to welcome Mr. Steve Hoffman, and thank you for being with us.
My pleasure. Hello to everybody. I hope everybody's healthy and safe. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to do this. When we first started, our commission was appointed September 1st of 2017. And when we first started, we reached out to the states that had preceded us down this path, particularly Colorado, Oregon, and Washington state. And they were all extraordinarily helpful to us. They answered our questions. They shared their lessons learned. They shared the mistakes they think they made that they would have liked to have gone back and undone or redone. And they were just extraordinarily helpful to us. And we've made it a commitment to all the states that are following us to do exactly the same thing. And so I've spoken to a number of states. I actually had some conversations in Virginia probably about a year ago, maybe a little bit longer. So it's a pleasure to be here, and I thank you for the opportunity. What I was told to do was talk about kind of how we're structured from a regulatory standpoint, and also talk a little bit about tax structure. My instructions were to speak for about 10 minutes and then answer questions. Is that still kind of what you'd like me to do?
Sir.
Yes, Steve, that'd be great.
Okay, so I think the best way to talk about structure is just to give a little bit of history. In Massachusetts, we moved in kind of two phases. In 2012, through a voter initiative, medical marijuana was approved. It was given to the Department of Public Health to oversee. The Department of Public Health is a very large government agency inside of an even larger government agency, Health and Human Services, and that is actually the largest department in the state. The Department of Public Health, I think, did a really good job. They wrote, I think, a very strong set of regulations for medical marijuana in Massachusetts. They moved quite slowly, however, and so the voter initiative that was passed in 2012, the first medical dispensary in Massachusetts didn't open until 2015. So that was kind of the history that we walked into. Then in November of 2016, the state voters approved an initiative to allow for the adult use of marijuana for recreational purposes. That was passed by a pretty close vote. It was 53% in favor and 47% opposed, and it remains to this day, 3+ years later, an incredibly controversial issue in the state with strong, adamant arguments on both sides of the equation. But the voter initiative was passed for adult use was passed in November of 2016. The legislature in Massachusetts immediately put a hold on it and said this law will not become final until we've had a chance to review it and perhaps modify it or perhaps even cancel it. But 8 months later, in July of 2017, the legislature passed and the governor signed legislation to create an adult use industry in the state of Massachusetts. And in that legislation was the structure of a regulatory body that became the Cannabis Control Commission. That was a 5-person independent commission jointly appointed by the governor, the attorney general, and the treasurer. And for the first year of our operation, our focus was solely on standing up the adult use industry in Massachusetts. But in the legislation was also the requirement that by the end of 2018, that we would assume regulatory responsibility for medical marijuana as well from the Department of Public Health. And so that transition did occur in December of 2018. And so from that point on, the Cannabis Control Commission has responsibility from a regulatory enforcement standpoint for both the adult use and the medical industry in Massachusetts. As far as I'm aware, we are the only independent regulatory body for marijuana. Most of the other states The regulatory body is embedded in another state agency, whether it's Treasury or alcoholic beverages. We're the only one that's independent, even though we're appointed by the Treasurer, Governor, and Attorney General. We do not report to them. And it's a little bit of a strange circumstance, which is that when we were appointed in September of 2017, we had legislative mandates in terms of timelines about when we had to have our regulations done, when we had to start accepting license applications, when we have some very explicit social equity and social justice mandates. But when we got appointed in September of 2017, essentially the appointing authorities, the governor, the attorney general, and the treasurer, kind of said, okay, we've done our job, and kind of that was the last we saw of them. And so there were 5 commissioners. We had no office, we had no budget, and we literally had to go back to the legislature and essentially beg for funding. Which we got, but it was not. And then, by the way, just for context, this is my first public service job. I had a 45-year career in the private sector. I had retired. I was failing at retirement. I was bored. This job came along from literally left field. I had no idea that this job even existed. But this is my first foray into government service, and it was a challenge getting started as an independent body. I think it works very well as an independent body. I'll contrast what we've been able to do in a relatively short period of time to what I mentioned, the 3-year time frame it took for the Department of Public Health to launch the first medical dispensary in the Department of Public Health. Because it's part of a much larger agency, there were multiple layers of approval required for pretty much any initiative or change that they took. And it was just very slow moving. As an independent agency, we have much more flexibility. We're able to, I think, move quite quickly. And we got our first set of regulations put in place. We were appointed, as I said, September 1st of 2017. We finalized our regulations for adult use in early March of 2018. Started accepting applications in April of 2018, and had stores up and running in November of 2018. So there are some, I think, real benefits of being an independent standalone agency. I think there's absolutely significant benefits from having both medical and adult use under the same regulatory body. The regulations that we developed for adult use were based very specifically on what the Department of Public Health put in place for the medical industry. But as we've taken responsibility for medical as well as adult use, I think we've synthesized 2 sets of regulations into one. I think it makes us much more efficient from an enforcement standpoint, from a cost standpoint, from a policy standpoint. So I think the structure of an independent agency with responsibility for both medical and adult use marijuana actually works really well. I'm biased, obviously, because that's a structure that I've been working in for the past 3 years, but I think it's a very effective structure. There are downsides to being an independent agency, which is that really we have no air cover. I think that the cynical interpretation, and I think there's unfortunately some truth to the cynical interpretation, is that, as I mentioned, the approval of adult use of marijuana in the state of Massachusetts was and is a very controversial issue. Virtually every senior official, elected official in the state opposed it, including the governor, the attorney general, and the treasurer, ironically, the 3 people that appointed the commission. I really do think that making us independent was done partly because people believed that was probably the right structure from an efficiency standpoint. But I also believe it was done because it also relieves any of the elected officials who oppose this law of accountability for what happens. And that has made it difficult. Whatever controversies have arisen, whatever challenges we face, we're on our own, and we don't really get, as I said, any air cover from any other state agency or from any elected officials. And I'm not. I sound like I'm complaining, but I think that is unquestionably a challenge. The other challenge, as I mentioned, is when we started, we had no resources, we had no staff, we had no money, we had no office, we had very short timelines and mandates. And had we been part of a larger agency, I think that, our startup would have been a lot more efficient because we would have been able to draw on the resources of whatever agency we were housed in. We really had, we had 5 commissioners writing our own regulations without any staff when we first got started. And I would be hard pressed to argue that was optimal. Now that, we're 3 years into it, we have a staff of approximately 75 people. We do have an office finally, although none of us have been there in 6 months. But once we built up our staff, I would again advocate strongly for a standalone independent agency that does have both medical and adult use under its aegis. I think that that's the most effective structure. I want to just answer the other question I was asked to talk about, which is tax structure. So tax structure is interesting. In the voter initiative that was passed in November of 2016 to create the adult use industry, inside of that was a tax retail only, so no tax at any other level of production but retail. That tax rate was approximately 13%. One of the things the legislature did when they got their hands on it and modified the laws, they raised the tax rate to 20%. That 20% tax is comprised of 3% local tax that cities or towns that host a retail establishment can charge. There's 6.25% state sales tax, which goes into the general fund. And then there is a 10.75% excise tax on adult use marijuana sold at retail. And that has become a source of controversy in the state. In the legislation, there are specific uses for those, the monies created by or generated by the excise tax. But the last section of that part of the legislation says subject to legislative appropriation. And so there is really no accountability about how that money has been used. It has not been used to further the objectives of the law. There's not a lot of traceability or accountability in terms of how that money is used. So, again, if I'm offering gratuitous advice, I would be thoughtful about not just how much tax you're raising and how you're raising tax money, but how the tax money is being used and being transparent about it. We, in our legislation, were required to submit a report to the legislature this past July, so 2 months ago, looking at alternative tax structures. As I said, we are only collecting tax at retail. The alternative tax structures we were asked to look at were a weight-based tax structure, as well as a potency-based tax structure, which has some other states have used. We hired KPMG to help us do this analysis. I cannot share their findings with you, unfortunately, explicitly, but I can tell you at a high level, the revenue differences between the different tax structures, at least according to KPMG, are de minimis. Part of the study included the participation of our State Department of Revenue. From their perspective, given that the revenue structures the revenue generated by the different structures was relatively the same. From their perspective, collecting a retail tax based upon revenue was by far and away the most straightforward and simplest way to generate or collect tax revenue here. KPMG also said that it analyzed and came up with a conclusion that at this stage of the industry, and we're still relatively early, we have 65 retail stores open. And we think we can get to probably 200 or 225, so we're maybe a third of the way there. At this stage, because we're not fully matured as a marketplace, KPMG concluded that revenue is the price of marijuana is actually relatively inelastic. And so, unfortunately, they told our legislators that if they raise the tax rate above 20%, they would actually generate more revenue, that they would not cause such a decline in purchasing that tax revenue would go down. As a matter of fact, the opposite, because of the inelasticity, it would go up. They were careful to say that when the market matures, that inelasticity will turn in the opposite direction and become more elastic. But for the time being, they essentially gave our legislature a green light to raise the tax rate above 20%. That's outside of my purview. I don't know what the legislature will do with it, but given obviously the financial challenge that all states are facing right now, I wouldn't be surprised if our legislature took action to raise the rate. But for the time being, is 20%. It is only at retail, and again, with the concurrence of our Department of Revenue, we think that's the most effective and straightforward way to raise tax revenue. So I think I just spoke for 15 minutes without breathing, but I hope I covered the topics that you were asking me to do, and I'm happy to respond to any questions you have on the issues, the topics raised, or anything else having to do with marijuana.
Hey, Steve, this is Secretary Moran. I just wanted to say thank you. We spoke at length some time ago. I don't know if it was as long as a year.
I do remember that, Secretary. How are you?
Pre-COVID seems like so long ago.
A different life, a different life.
Yeah, indeed. So lots of questions. You have a great group here that have listened to you, so I know there are going to be a lot of good specific questions. Just my quick one. Well, you must be independent the way you talk about the elected officials. You must be.
I was a little careful about that, but I thought I'd share at least my honest perspective with you.
I can't imagine they would set up independent and absolve them of any responsibility. I can't imagine them doing that.
No comment.
So. Your staff, we have Travis Hill on the line. He runs our Alcohol Beverage Control Commission. Unlike Massachusetts, where you have package stores and they're independent, we're a control state. So
right.
He has a law enforcement arm, regulatory arm.
Yeah.
Well, how do you handle that as an independent commission? Do you hire law enforcement and how big is your staff? If you could just walk me through
Sure.
a little bit more understanding how your staff operates and how large and what responsibilities they have.
Sure. No, that's a good question. So as I think I mentioned, we have approximately 75 people on our staff. The biggest single group is our enforcement team. And our enforcement team is essentially divided into three pieces. There's a licensing piece that does the analysis and the evaluation of applications for licenses. There's an inspection team which does both pre-license and post-license inspections to ensure compliance. And then we have an enforcement team that takes action if appropriate and necessary if there are some compliance issues. I think the total between those three groups is probably 25 people. But it's not a law enforcement operation. So, we have in our regulations and because of the legislation, we have enforcement capability that includes fines, suspensions, rescindment of licenses, and other remedies available to us if there are compliance issues. To the extent that there's any actual violation of law, we refer that to an outside agency, a law enforcement agency. We do not have any law enforcement capability within our agency.
And where do your revenues come from to pay for that? I heard the 20%, and it's all designated into what sounds like the general fund. And how do you have a fee on top of that?
No. The way it works is, again, just to reiterate, so there's 20% tax at retail. 3% goes into 3% is a local tax that goes to the city or town that hosts the marijuana retailer. 6.25% is state sales tax, and that goes into the general fund. And then the remaining 10.75% is an excise tax, and that is where we get our funding from. But because the entirety of the 10.75% excise tax is subject to legislative appropriation, we every year need to get an appropriation from the legislature to fund our operations. And thus far, through 3 years of our history, we have gotten what we've asked for from the legislature. I think that they understand that it's a little bit of a return on investment kind of proposition. That the more licensing agents we have, and the bigger our staff is, the more stores we can open, the more revenue we can generate. So they've been very supportive, although it's a long process. This year I think all bets are off. So our state is on a July 1st fiscal year basis, July 1st to June 30th. We do not have a budget in place for fiscal 2021. We've been told by the legislature that we're unlikely to have a budget in place until October at the earliest. So we're operating month to month from previous year's budget. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if we're asked to take a little bit of a haircut, just given the overall financial requirements of the state during this crisis. But our funding, as I said, comes from the excise tax, but it's not automatic. We again have to get legislative appropriation. And just to give you an order of magnitude, between adult use and medical, our budget is roughly $16 million.
Thank you. Thank you. I know there's going to be other questions. Again, very much appreciate the time you've allowed us.
Sure, no problem. My pleasure.
Mr. Hoffman, this is Joel Bernal with Department of Agriculture. You did mention social equity mandates, and we're trying to learn from other states to establish our programs in an equitable way. So could you talk a little bit more about how you implemented some of those in Massachusetts?
Happy to do so. I will also say this is the hardest part of our job, in my opinion, in terms of making significant progress in this area. So for context, the enabling legislation that created our commission has a few requirements. One is it has a diversity requirement, essentially that the industry look like our state in terms of diversity, both ethnic, gender, and so forth. And the second is a more explicit mandate that says I'll quote this to you, we have to ensure that those communities that were disproportionately impacted by marijuana prohibition are full participants in the new industry. That's the exact language. There are some problems with that, which is there is no definition of which communities were disproportionately harmed by marijuana prohibition. There's also no definition of what is full participation in the industry. So we took it upon ourselves to define things as follows. So we brought in a sociologist, demographer, and we looked at arrest rates, incarceration rates, unemployment rates, and we literally did it down to the zip code. For cities and towns that were under 50,000, we just designated them as one of these harmed communities or not. But for the bigger cities and towns, we went down literally to the neighborhood level. And we ended up with a list, and I won't tell you it's perfect, but we ended up with a list of 29 communities that we designated as disproportionately harmed by marijuana prohibition. And we also said to us, full participation in this industry means not just employment opportunities, but management opportunities and ownership opportunities in the business. And so that's the mandate we've set for ourselves. And we've done a lot, but we still are fighting what I consider to be an uphill battle. So what we've done is, first of all, people from those communities were allowed to apply as soon as we opened our window for applications in April of 2018. They were allowed to apply for what we called economic empowerment status, which essentially got them the front of the queue. And so their applications were considered before anybody else. We reduced their licensing fees, we reduced their application fees, and that was one step. The second step was we also simultaneously created a social equity program. And again, for people from those communities that were harmed, disproportionately harmed, the social equity program essentially is a training program. We train people in how to run a business, how to write a resume, re-entry if they had a criminal record. And we also gave those people priority, people that graduated from the program, we gave them priority in our application process. And we are making strides, but we are nowhere near where we need to be. And I will tell you the two things that are the biggest challenge in terms of us getting to where we need to be. One is Massachusetts has a very strong tradition of local rule. And so while the state agency that I chair is the only agency that licenses marijuana establishments, before we can even consider a license, an agreement has to be reached between the applicant and the city or town in which they wish to locate, called the host community agreement. And the cities and towns are all doing it differently. There are 351 cities and towns that are doing this very differently, and none of them have an equity or social justice mandate. The only mandate is at the state level. So you find, we can't force the cities or towns to give host community agreements to the people we're trying to help. It's got to be through their decision, and that just has created a challenge. But the bigger challenge by far is funding, which is that we gave out, I mentioned the economic empowerment status. We gave that out to 130 people in April of 2018. There are 35 of them that have licenses 3 years later. But that means that there's, 100 plus or minus that haven't even applied for licenses yet. And when we asked them why not, we went back to them and said, how come, because we can't give out a license to somebody that doesn't apply for one. We said, how come? And got three answers. One is they said, can't get a host community agreement, which I just talked about. Two is that they were waiting for us to authorize new kinds of license categories, which we just did for social consumption and home delivery. But the third and by far most prevalent reason we got was we don't have any money. And nobody, because of the federal prohibition, nobody is lending money into this industry. We have been very successful in getting banks into the industry to support the industry, but just they do cash management. They help companies, move their cash from the business to the bank, but nobody's lending into this industry. None of the traditional sources of financing are available. We have been pushing very hard to take some of the 10.75% excise tax, which again is subject to legislative appropriation, and to use some of that money to create a fund to provide low or no interest loans to these individuals. It has been introduced into the legislature. It has come out of committee, but I don't know that it's making a lot of progress. I will refer you guys to Illinois. So Illinois was the next state after us. And Illinois, actually, unlike the rest of the states that did this through voter initiative, Illinois did it through legislative action, the creation of the adult use industry in Illinois. I'm really proud of the fact that they have mirrored to a very large extent our social equity mandates in legislation, but they took it one step further, and they have taken some of their tax revenue and specifically designated it to go into a fund to help these entrepreneurs in these disproportionately harmed communities. So we're making progress. We're working incredibly hard at it. We are far, far ahead of where we were even a year ago, but we're nowhere near where we need to be. And I think those are some of the obstacles.
That good work is never easy work. And I appreciate you sharing your challenges and some of the things that you all have done. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Sure.
Dr. Bernard, we still have time for a couple more questions. If Steve can stick around with us, our other person, he just logged on. I'm going to get him situated. But if Steve, if you can stick around for maybe a couple more minutes.
I can give you another 10 minutes if that would be useful, if there are other questions.
Yes, thank you. Are there any other questions for Mr. Hoffman while we have him here with us?
Yes, Michael Carter, small farmer. Thank you, Mr. Hoffman, for your time. I had a couple of questions. Your grower supply, is that all from in-state? Massachusetts is not known as an agricultural state, so I'm just curious.
I'm sorry, could you repeat I just didn't hear the first half of your question. I apologize.
The grower supply,
Yeah.
Is that all in-state?
Yeah, everything's in state because, this is federally illegal, so nothing can cross state lines.
Right.
So we have a seed to sale tracking system. So every time a plant gets to 8 inches tall, it gets a unique RFID identifier, and that identifier stays with that plant through cultivation, through processing, manufacturing, and all the way through retail. And so what we can do is ensure that anything that is sold at retail was grown in state. And also, diversion works two ways. One is, things coming in from out of state and sold in Massachusetts, but diversion works the other way as well, which is we also can ensure that anything that's grown in state stays in state. So you guys are, I'm sure all familiar with the Justice Department's perspective on this, which, there was the Cole Memorandum back in the Obama days that essentially said, we recognize this is federally illegal, but we're not going to interfere with any state that chooses to do it, as long as a few things are clear. One is that absolutely nobody under age can legally purchase in your state. Two is that there's no criminal money being used to finance these businesses. And third, that there's no diversion. And again, diversion is stuff grown in state and sold out of state, or stuff grown out of state and sold in state. And when Barr became the Attorney General, or I guess it was his predecessor, actually, Jeff Sessions, they rescinded the Cole Memorandum And Sessions said, I'm going to let my state U.S. attorneys determine what they're going to do about, marijuana if it's legal in that state. And our U.S. attorney essentially said, I've got bigger fish to fry, but if there's any diversion, if I see any issues about marijuana coming in or out of the state, I will take action. So we're pretty clear about the imperative of ensuring that we can track everything to know that everything that's sold in state was grown in state, and again, anything that's grown in state stays in state. But you're absolutely right. Massachusetts is not a great agricultural climate. And one of the things that's interesting, because it's really not a national business, it's a state by state business for all the reasons I just said. The prices in Massachusetts are much higher than pretty much any other state that's legalized. And it's because most of the cultivation that is done in Massachusetts in this industry is done indoors, which is extraordinarily expensive, from a utility and a lighting standpoint, from an air conditioning and lighting standpoint. So it's expensive. We also have very stringent environmental rules, particularly because this is such an energy intensive industry in Massachusetts. And I'm very proud of how aggressively we have developed and implemented environmental rules to make this as green an industry as possible.
Thank you. And I have
oh, I'm sorry.
one more. No problem.
Mr. Card, I think we have a hard stop with our next speaker. So if you can email me your next question, I'll get it to Mr. Hoffman so he can follow up with you. Is that okay?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
I'm happy to do that, Jill. Anybody can. You have my contact information, obviously. So anybody, if you want to send me whatever questions, I'm happy to follow up. I'm also happy to get on the phone again at some subsequent point if that would be useful to you guys.
Thank you, Mr. Carter. Thank you, Mr. Hoffman, for joining us today. We really appreciate your time, and it's been very helpful and very beneficial. Thanks so much.
I wish you the best of luck.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye. And so we will move forward on the agenda with Mr. Justin Nordhorn. I apologize if I mispronounced that, who has joined us from the Washington State Liquor and Cannabis Board, and he is the Chief of Enforcement. So I will go ahead and welcome Mr. Nordhorn, and thank you for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. So I had a couple questions that we received, and so I believe we sent you the standard kind of presentation in a PowerPoint, but I know that as time is limited, I'm not going to go through each and every slide, but you do have that for reference, correct?
I don't remember seeing that, Chief Nordhorn, but I will go back in my email and try to find that and pull it up.
Okay, and I don't need it on the screen. I'm just going to go through a couple of slides, but it'll give you a breadth of information, and you're welcome to follow up with us afterwards if there are any questions on that. So the 2 points of interest it sounded like that you were looking for is kind of how we're structured, why we chose the structure that we did, any type of lessons learned, as well as the fiscal impacts on both of the state costs with IT, FTEs, and the like, as well as additional revenue issues. So I'll try to focus some of the overview on that, but just as a quick overview, we were one of the first states out of in the nation to legalize alongside of Colorado. Ours was done through an initiative, so there were a lot of gaps. It wasn't a lot of stakeholder interaction as the legislation was developed. It was drafted and then presented to the state voters for the vote. So our system is just slightly different than many other states across the nation, insofar as ours was modeled after the alcohol control model. So we were modeled after a three-tier system, meaning that you're going to have your manufacturers, distributors, and retailers. However, the cannabis market is set up without the distribution tier in Washington State. And so what that looks like is essentially your manufacturer side, your producers or processors cannot have any vested interest in the retail side, and there can't be undue influence in those types of things crossing over the threshold. So The true control state models are typically the state would be running the sales and distribution, whereas we do have a licensing model, but it's a segregation of retailers from the manufacturer. So we're not vertically integrated like many states are. So our structure, I present that just so you have a context for how we're structured in some of these areas. Of course, we had to develop a lot of laws and rules. The baseline for us to decriminalize our possession implemented a 37% tax. The initial bill actually had a 25% excise tax assessed at the producer, processor, and retailer level. That was changed legislatively to a 37% excise tax on the final point of sale, which was revenue neutral. And it's much easier to do the tax collection at the retail point than every time that there's a transactional change throughout the supply chain. So if we look at our primary roles and responsibilities are the oversight, and we have a licensing division, and they do the intake. And when we first started our program, we had a 30-day window of application, which we followed after Colorado. And we found from a lessons learned standpoint that presented a lot of challenges. We had this huge influx of licensing applications, and we had a limited number of licenses. On the retail side, we were only allowed to have around 330. Later, with the medical integration, we're up to 550 retail licenses, but we had over 2,000 applications just for retail in the onset. And so when we were looking at this, there were those who were prepared, there were others that weren't prepared to apply, and so a lot of folks got left out. There was still some apprehension from different communities across the state on what would the federal government do. And so having that window of opportunities to apply, I think, creates barriers. And we have things in place right now that we're looking at legislatively around the diversity, equity, and inclusion areas that hopefully will correct some of those missed opportunities for folks that are out there. We also have a enforcement team that we do for our particular organization. We govern and do oversight of alcohol, cannabis, and tobacco. The policy decisions are primarily alcohol and cannabis. And so when we first started this, we had a generalist approach where all of the officers across the state would do alcohol and cannabis. When it came to retail sales, we figured, okay, the retailers should be the same concepts. You have a convenience store, you have a to-go store, same thing with cannabis. And so they should be fairly similar. But what we found is the cannabis stores took us at least 5 more times the amount of time spent when we're talking about traceability management, those types of things in those stores. And so eventually what we've done is we've consolidated, so we have one area of expertise for cannabis. And so now all of our officers, which we currently have about 34 across the state, doing nothing but producing, processing, and retail oversight in the cannabis industry. So we went away from the generalist approach, and that has brought forward a considerable amount of improved consistency on information sharing, on enforcement application, and the like. So that's something that was really important. And for us, we have some fairly significant geographic areas in our state, and having the spread of information across too many people, I think, created some challenges, especially when they didn't have the time to become full experts in that particular area. Of course, we have a traceability system. We started out with BioTrek, and then we moved into the LEAF MJ Freeway system. And so our traceability has had some changes in there, which has also presented some gaps. But in talking with folks across the nation, I don't think that there's any one silver bullet for a traceability system. We're currently reviewing some of the issues around traceability and what's necessary for it, and looking long-term into the future. If we were to say, if the federal government were to come out and legalize or deschedule cannabis as a Schedule I narcotic, would we need as robust of a traceability system? And we believe the answer is no. We wouldn't need that robust of a traceability if it were legal across the United States. but would there still be a role for that system? And we believe the answer is yes. When you're looking at different types of agricultural products, there are methodologies that people will use, whether it's meat or whether it's fruit and vegetables. When we're talking about recalls for safety issues, whether it's E. coli or salmonella or something like that, which is present on the cannabis plants or can be, that you need to have some sort of a mechanism that if we have something that's out in the community, how do we pull that back if that's necessary as a public health issue? So if we scroll down to slide 8, we have some basic structural functions around criminal history. We don't, we do have a residency requirement, and that's being looked at more and more. But because of the federal conflicts, we believe it's still necessary to maintain a lot of the license ownership within the state to be able to vet, making sure that there's not criminal organizations coming in on unauthorized licensees. But we have branched it out into allowing for more financiers and those types of things. Our state is set up where we have 3 state chartered banks and 3 credit unions that are willing to bank with our cannabis industry. So that's been a tremendous help. And that's one of the continual challenges on the federal side is not having the appropriate banking, which is also still drives a lot of areas of cash-based retail services. And so we do see a number of robberies that occur within the stores across the state and those types of things based on that cash base. So if there are opportunities to be able to fold in either online sales where people can utilize a credit card, a gift card, something like that, and then go pick up the product, that might be an idea for streamlining a lower cash-based business. And those concepts are still being discussed in our state. Right now, we don't allow for the online sales, but it's certainly something that we're revisiting, especially given the restrictions with COVID. So if we look, we've done a lot around consumer safety. I won't go into too much detail unless there's questions on that. Number of licenses that we licensed, close to 2,000 license locations, and that's reflected on slide 12. And if we're looking at the number of retailers, again, we talked about having an initial licensure of about 350 retailers across the state. When we had our medical cannabis structure, if you will, it was highly unregulated. It was actually passed in 1998. The governor vetoed a whole bunch of provisions in that particular legislation, which left it kind of the Wild West as far as no oversight, but we had essentially dispensaries or retail stores across the state. So we collapsed all of that in 2015 and brought everything into our recreational marketplace. So you can have a medical endorsement, so you can be able to sell some higher content product to patients and that sort of thing. But at the same time, everything is now condensed into these 500 stores. The other important thing I'll highlight, because I know a lot of other states do allow for some home grows. Sometimes there's restrictions and whatnot, depending on where retail stores are or for patients. But we don't currently allow any type of home growing in our state. The other thing that we don't currently allow, which is a big interest point, is home delivery of products. So those are 2 areas that we're going to differ from some other folks. Just shifting quickly into the financial area, if you go on to slide 14, you'll be able to see some of the finances there. And we've continued to see growth in the marketplace. We certainly saw that in the time of the COVID period from April or mid-March through present. And we believe some of the increase as of late has to do with drawing a little bit out of the illicit market. There's still an illicit marketplace in Washington state. There's less prioritization on prosecution of cannabis crimes. And so unless it's a really big operation, there's usually less interest in prosecution, which has opened the door for people to feel comfortable in trying to do it illegally and sending it out of state. So we still have some diversion from the unlicensed marketplaces, but we are seeing an increased growth, and that's not necessarily new users. That could be a combination of new users as well as people having the convenience of not having to go to a location that is potentially higher risk, especially in COVID. So they're going into the store where it's controlled, mask requirements and the like. And so we're seeing more consumers coming over from that area as well. But we are starting to taper off. And again, when we first started, we had a handful of stores to start off with, and every year it's grown. More licenses have been issued. We've had some bans and moratoriums across the state that have shifted. We still have some of those in different counties, but they have lifted. And so as we see those dynamics shifting, we will see this increase in the revenue and excise taxes that were collected. And the next slide really shows some of the revenue projections that we have when you're talking about the amount of cannabis revenues for the state. And so you'll be able to use this as a good reference point for Washington State on what that looks like coming in. And if we go down to slide 18, you'll be able to see a quick snapshot of the price per gram. And so we're very competitive with the illicit market based on some of the oversight structure and whatnot. And you're going to be able to see, this is a little bit of an older slide, but it still is remaining true, that the two price per gram thresholds are fairly competitive around the $7 a gram area. So when we look at the infrastructure, one of the things that we share with folks on our licensing side of the equation, when we first started, we had a lot of temporary workers, and we figured that we would have this onslaught of license applications, and then that would peter out because we wouldn't be licensing new businesses. But one of the things that we found is there's a tremendous amount of interest in change requests. People changing ownerships, financial interests, different nuances. They're trying to get a creative edge in the marketplace, so they're changing and shifting floor plans and dynamics within the stores and the grows. And so when you're seeing all of those changes, you have a lot of change requests. So obviously you're going to need staff to be able to process those types of changes. For the enforcement side of the equation, based on the nature of how long it takes, especially in the licensed grows, and we only allow a 30,000 square foot grow as our biggest grow, which is only 3/4 of an acre. So whether it's indoor or outdoor, that's our largest grow size. And even with that, it typically will take an officer several hours to go through and do an inspection in those types of locations. So our threshold that we've come up with, ideally, we would have about 60 licensees per officer to be able to manage. And with the looming budget cuts that we have, we're going to be sliding back from that, but that's our identified target on the appropriate amount of enforcement oversight. We've done some changes on some of the laws since the initiative passed, which again, it was very, very restrictive to try to meet some interest around the federal government. And with some of those changes, some of the oversight is now shifting to be a little bit more softer, very education focused, to make sure people understand the complexities and the nuances in that particular area. So we are looking at standing up a non-commissioned unit to do primarily focused on education and consultation visits, and yet maintaining the enforcement arm of the division there to deal with some of the issues such as the diversion issues, illicit sales to minors, and those types of things. One of the things that you may also want to consider when you're talking about the enforcement approach is some of the ancillary issues that come up that can be related to both unlicensed and licensed locations. And we have a case right now that we're dealing with that has a lot of red flags around human trafficking. So we're seeing foreign nationals who aren't being paid for employment, and that's obviously a red flag. And these are even at licensed facilities. And so those are some of the things that the non-commissioned folks would not be able to necessarily deal with as effectively. So we really take a look at those types of things. I know that there's a whole bunch of information in the presentation, but I just wanted to touch base a little bit on the structure as well as the financial piece that you had asked about. And I'll leave the last several minutes here for questions, and we're certainly always available for follow-up at any time once the presentation is done. So I'll open it up for any questions that y'all have.
Hi, I guess I'll go first. Negus to Bebi. I work with Columbia Care, one of the medical processors here in Virginia. Really appreciate your presentation and the slides you shared and look forward to going over those more deeply. But I did want to ask you, as it relates to the taxation question and the different tax rates, have you all seen any challenges with enforcing a tax rate or having a tax rate so high, potentially diverting folks into the unlicensed market for the better price competition? I know that's come up in California. I'm just curious how it's been showing up for Washington.
Yeah, so you're always going to have illicit market issues when you're talking about taxes if it's not comparable. So when we look at tax rates in the state, ours was set up early on at this high tax rate. Our neighboring state of Oregon has a lower tax rate, but we're not seeing a lot of cross-border. I mean, there is some obviously, but we're not seeing this tremendous cross-border type of purchasing from Oregon to bring back into Washington. I think the tax rate issue compared to the illicit market, yes, it does bring up the price point for the product being purchased, but there's a lot of safeguards around product purchasing it in the legal marketplace. And so you have the testing, you have that type of oversight that's going on with the product. And so theoretically, you're buying a safer product than you would on the illicit market side. And some people will say, "Oh, I only do green and I'm organic," and those types of things. Some of the unlicensed facilities that we've taken action on and conducted search warrants and the like, we actually ran some of those that product through pesticide testing, and it was really high and off the charts kind of a thing. So I think people do recognize that, and if they're looking for that product safety, there's a little bit more confidence coming into the legal marketplace. So I think that does adjust for the concern around the taxation issue. But we haven't had any problems collecting that high tax. We actually have pretty good tax compliance.
Justin, this is Travis Hill with Virginia ABC. First I'll leave by saying we miss Washington from NABCA's perspective. But I'd be interested, since you guys have liquor and cannabis, did you guys have any crossover with your agents? Did you, or are they just two entirely separate responsibilities, and how much did one inform the other on that?
Yeah, so we have dual responsibility in this area. And at first, like I said, we kind of took that generalist approach where I think the knowledge specific areas of opportunity are better having the separate units. Now, having said that, all officers can still help one another. So if we do have a large illicit grow, we're going to call over folks from the liquor side and our tobacco side to be able to help go in and process these grows. And we had one that we've seized over 2 tons of product. And so if you only have a handful of officers, you're not going to be able to process that kind of a scene that quickly. And so it's really important for us, at least we found, to be able to have the flexibility to bring those other resources to bear. So we have the commissioning is all the same for all of our officers. They're just in specialty units to say we're going to be doing the focus on alcohol in this area, tobacco or cannabis in these other areas. It's almost like traditional law enforcement detective work. Somebody's dealing with homicide and somebody else is dealing with property crimes. They're both unique and they're going to be special skill sets, and yet they can cross over and help one another out when necessary. But I'll add, it does require some added training thoughts, and we're actually going through our training program to try to shore that up, because the longer you're out of one of those fields, then you become rusty. So we need to keep that knowledge base up for the baseline knowledge for each of the areas active. So that's one of the things that we're moving towards shoring up for our operations.
And I think you said, so you've got 34 that are specifically dedicated to the cannabis side. Is that?
Yeah, we have about 34 line officers. So I have 5 teams out across the state for first line supervisors, and then a couple managers, one on the east side and one on the west side.
Thank you.
Are there any more questions for Chief Nordhorn.
This is Michael Carter. I had a question just about how did you incorporate the credit unions in the process, and how easy or difficult was that?
So it was a challenge. We had the interest, and what we did in our state is work with our Department of Financial Institutions, and we had a number of meetings with them to try to figure out ways to look at this. And then you have because it's a state chartered bank or a credit union in the state, and it didn't go outside of the state, there was a lot more comfort from those folks. And so the oversight entity of the Department of Financial Institutions worked with those folks to be able to get that established. One of the things that they've also done is we've licensed what we call money transmitters in our state. So people who want to use a closed loop system, for lack of a better term, it's almost a money laundering type of a thing, but somebody can go in with a credit card, buy some cryptocurrency in the store, and then immediately transact that for the product. And so if it's a licensed money transmitter, we've allowed that in the state so people can actually use their credit cards to be able to do some purchasing, but it's not widespread at this point in our state. But the Department of Financial Institutions have also helped set that program up.
Chief Nordhorn, I know you have to leave. I'll just ask if anyone has one more question while we have the chief with us.
Yeah, if there are any other follow-up questions, you can feel free to email me and or Rick, and we'll be happy to set something up if you need a follow-up conversation that goes into other details, whether it's pesticide testing, traceability, any of those issues. I know this was kind of a quick run through. We're happy to help anybody explore those types of issues and share our experience, because not everything was perfect, and we certainly have some of those lessons learned that we're willing to share. So anything that you need moving forward, please feel free to reach out, and we'd love to do that in sorts.
Thank you, Chief Nordhorn, for joining us, and we appreciate the presentation, and we've got some resources that you've left for us to review, and thank you for allowing us to follow up. So we appreciate your time today.
Absolutely. Thank you much. You have a great day.
All right. As we move on to the next speaker, very excited to introduce Deputy Commissioner Charles Green, who is with the Virginia Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. And Deputy Commissioner Green has done a lot to engage our staff here at VDAX with talking with other states to learn more about their program. And he has a presentation today to discuss the programs in both Colorado and Oregon. So happy to turn this over to you, Deputy Commissioner.
Thanks a lot. Are you able to see my screen here?
Yes, yeah. Looks great.
Perfect. All right. Charles Green, we held, leading up to, I guess, this work group, conversations with a number of different states just to get an idea of their overall program structures and how the different regulatory responsibilities were divided amongst state agencies. So the following is a hopefully short presentation on two of the states we spoke with, Colorado and Oregon. And I will give a disclaimer that it's kind of the presentation here is not their official presentations. It's based on the conversations that I had, the commissioner had, and our staff with those states. So apologize for any inaccuracies or things that are a little bit vague. I do know we did get a full length presentation from Colorado of about 30 plus slides. So pass that on to Deputy Secretary to share with the group, as well as the organizational chart for their marijuana enforcement division. First thing we asked the states when we met with them was could they walk us through the timeline for legalization of adult use? And so the next two slides are those timelines, and not getting into the specifics, but one thing that was very interesting, I think, to our staff was that in one sense, both states took a long time from sort of the first stages through to full adult use legalization, but that last step, or once the tipping point was reached where a voter referendum was held on adult use and was successful, the time between that and the first retail sales happening in those states proceeded really, really quickly. And sometimes, in some cases, two years or less, which was amazingly short. And again, you'll see for Oregon as well, kind of that last step, amazingly short or compressed time period between the legalization initiative and then when the first retail sales actually took place. Next thing we asked about was just general observations and what would those states recommend to a state like Virginia, who was considering this subject. And so some of the big takeaways are listed here. One of the things that we heard from not only these states, but some others was the value of establishing what one state called a cannabis cabinet, or a formal group of either secretariats or agency heads that are mandated to come together on a frequent basis to address the challenges of starting up a program. Everything from, hey, we're missing something, or you've got a regulation in your state agency that needs to be updated to address this, and that be something that happened on a regular basis. The second thing was, again, thinking back to the compressed time frame, was that the regular Administrative Process Act may not allow, or may not, because the time it takes to go through the APA, that if you're really looking at standing up retail sales quickly, standard APA may not be appropriate, and you may need to look at expedited regulatory authority for agencies to address all of the regulatory issues that they would have to address. I think we heard it in one of the calls today, but for Massachusetts, one of the things that may not be considered fully by a legislature when they're standing up a program is that it costs money, and that an agency, whether it's a new standalone agency or an existing agency, needs FTEs and funding to do that, and they cannot wait for the revenue of either licenses or taxes to roll in to that. And so some upfront seed money needs to be put in place to get things started. And those budgets tend to grow over time. The current budget for Colorado is 22 million, and for Oregon's latest biennial budget for marijuana enforcement is 24.7 million. So, and then one other observation too is there's a lot of emphasis or thought put into the positions or resources that may be needed in that agency that's going to be doing the regulations. But in most states, there are a lot of other agencies that have either regulations or an oversight function, and those tend to be considered as an afterthought, and that those agencies have had to go back and ask for FTEs or ask for funding once they realize the scale, scope of work that's being assigned to them, or that they need to take into account as an industry is stood up. And then another general observation on how social equity is being handled or can be handled partially. And one is Colorado mentioned that they are instituting additional license types, and specifically ones in hospitality and delivery that have very low barriers to entry in terms of financial resources needed to get into the marijuana delivery business, or maybe work in hospitality or open up some type of hospitality venue. And then also, I think it was mentioned in the last presentation, possible limits on vertical integration or the scope or scale of ownership that any individual company may have, again, to spread the opportunities around to different either geographical areas or socioeconomic participants in the market. So in general, overview of sort of Colorado system that we got for them, and kind of big scale or big picture regulation is, requirements, obviously it's, adults. They have a possession requirement. They use in Colorado an equivalency. We asked about this, how they handle flour versus edibles and concentrates, and they've come up with an equivalency calculation. So if you go into a dispensary and you want to buy a combination of flour and edible chocolate bar, you kind of, the dispensary can figure out how much you're allowed to purchase. Home grow is allowed in Colorado with up to 3 mature plants, a total of 6. All retail sales are through licensed entities. And then localities may institute stricter requirements than the state actually does, and may disallow dispensaries from operating, or even other types of licensed establishments for operating within their jurisdictions. Fairly similar in Oregon. I think some differences that we noticed were that the possession limits may be slightly different than what the actual purchase limits are, whereas Colorado, those two seem to be aligned a little bit differently, but again, fairly similar on the other points. And then the localities may also allow or restrict retail sales, but individual locality cannot ban personal possession. In Colorado, the overall regulation or oversight is handled by the Marijuana Enforcement Division, which is within their Department of Revenue. And the different license types, they license basically everything from cultivators all the way through to the retail stores, but that includes product manufacturers, research and development facilities, transporters, and this would be transporters from cultivators to retail sites or to processors. They license testing facilities, obviously the retail stores, and they are soon right now, but I think have yet to announce any delivery or hospitality licenses on the adult use side. They do also use a seed to sale tracking system, and the primary agency responsible for that, it was mentioned in another presentation about the RFID tags, kind of starting when the plants are immature seedlings, and RFID or barcode technology used to track the product all the way through the system. To me, they appeared to have a fairly complex fee schedule that really would take looking at carefully to, depending on the type of business that you're getting in and whether it's initial application or renewal, but to figure out, what your fees are that you're paying there for licensing. And they also mentioned, not only is it consideration for the businesses that are licensed, but everybody working in the industry is credentialed. When we asked about kind of, how many businesses are licensed and people credentialed, it's as you can see here, about 3,000 plus businesses licenses in the different categories, and about 40,000 individuals, which obviously is, annually is a tremendous workload, I think, for them to accomplish that. They also provided, and I've provided to the Deputy Secretary, the org charts that they have. I think they noted they have about 150 FTEs within the Marijuana Enforcement Division that handles this work. In Oregon, it's the Oregon Liquor and Cannabis Control Board that regulates this. So that was an existing state agency that was cannabis was added into. The different license types they have are producers, processors, labs, research, wholesalers, and retailers. Some details there are, unlike, I think, individually licensing transporters and some of the different other functions that Colorado licenses, some of these producer license types allow for transportation and other functions that may be licensed separately in other states. Again, OLCC is responsible for their seed to sale tracking system, and they noted, again, a substantial number of businesses and individuals that they have licensed or credentialed and do so on an annual basis. When we asked about the different types of positions that the primary regulator has within them, They fell into a couple of different categories, which are noted here. Some states may call these what's called a licensing or registration staff. In one state, maybe something a little bit different, but in general, there's a focus on licensing and registration assistance. There's some type of auditing or investigation staff in some states with law enforcement authority and others not. There are data related positions in many states, and these have to do again with the seed to sale tracking system. And again, these are positions that are looking for inversion, diversion, making sure taxes are paid appropriately. A number of states also mentioned that they didn't start out with any sort of scientific or laboratory related positions, but as they have gotten further into regulation development or recognized challenges with new products or processed products or things like pesticides in products or food related products, that they've realized the value and need for bringing on scientific and specifically lab related positions. Oregon mentioned they do have one position that's a liaison that works with within their Department of Agriculture that is funded directly through OLCC's fees. And this is because there are so many functions within the Department of Ag that are handled, like pesticide, weights and measures, and others, that they felt the need for that position. And then they also mentioned, that especially within existing agencies, when you add in all these new functions, there are also central functions of an agency like human resources or financial processing, et cetera, that need to be considered because you're going to have additional workload with those functions as well within an agency. Both of the states we talked to discussed the importance of a robust seed to sale tracking system and provider, and that's in order to provide good oversight and, again, avoid inversion or diversion and make sure that the appropriate taxes are being paid on products. And some of the main components of kind of best practices here are that it makes most sense for the system to be housed within that primary regulator. One oddity, and I know this is not Oregon or Colorado, but we also spoke with California, and their Department of Agriculture actually houses the seed to sale tracking system, and I think has created some challenges for them because they license the cultivators, but the majority of the licensing happens outside of that agency, so it creates some challenges. However, one of the key points is that the primary regulator isn't the only state agency that needs access to that system. So making sure a system is set up where other agencies that have regulatory oversight or auditing oversight, or are going in for example, the Department of Taxation, if they're not the primary regulator, may need to go in and verify or want to go in and verify information, and them having access to the system is critical. Also, we wanted to know kind of how these systems were funded and paid for. And it looked like the most prevalent model was that the primary agency pays a relatively small, flat annual fee, $40,000 to $60,000 or $70,000. But most of the revenue generated that goes to the service provider is generated through the sale of required RFID tags and labels. And then also every business that's licensed pays a monthly sort of technical support fee, because all those businesses are inputting data into that centralized system that's overseen by the primary regulator. And then another key point of this is just the states also mentioned that, with 4,000 plus businesses and, 50 to 60,000 individual employees in these sectors, that a high level of training and continual training is definitely a necessity, so that the businesses know how to use the system and are inputting data correctly into the system. Some of the areas we discussed also, we wanted to know kind of, okay, what, got a decent understanding of what the primary regulator does, but what about other agencies that are going to have to be involved in standing up an adult use program. Again, to reiterate, the data sharing is very important with other agencies, and then a lot of states mentioned specific areas that they had to address regulatory wise, or because of in some states, in Colorado, for example, there was a sort of expose early on about pesticide residue and other adulterants in marijuana products. So things like pesticide regulation, very important. Food safety for edibles, consumables, beverage products. And then one thing that we hadn't thought of is the number of weighing and measuring devices that are out there in the industry, not only scales at retail sales, but was described to us, in trim operations. Some of these operations may have dozens, if not, 100 or more scales of high caliber precision that have to be put in effect. And then there's also the consideration of input from localities regarding land use and zoning, and then environmental or resource issues. It was mentioned previously, the energy utilization. Oregon specifically mentioned they've got very strict water usage requirements, and then also waste materials, any waste materials or byproducts that are coming out of this industry, and how are those handled, and what agencies in a state, possibly like a DEQ in Virginia, that might have to get involved in disposal or of those types of things. So hope that was a very quick and dirty overview of Colorado and Oregon, and I'll answer to the best of my ability any questions that I can.
Thank you, Deputy Commissioner Green. Do we have any questions? That means you really did a very thorough job.
Charles, this is Travis. I'm trying to figure out how to ask the question. And with the seed to sale tracking, I'm assuming that's the responsibility of one particular entity, even if maybe there's some regulatory handover. But you really, I think that's where you talk about that primary regulator really having the responsibility on really accounting for where that product is from a seedling all the way up into retail. That's how that's envisioned.
Yeah, and what we found was that there were, a handful of service providers that sort of specialize in this sector. I think most states use, one of maybe two or three different companies, but that a primary agency is the one that issues a request for proposals that says, we have a need for a seed to sale tracking system, and puts that out, and then that agency is the one that contracts with that service, that service provider to provide that service in their state, and that agency then is kind of in charge of the system in general, kind of that system, and also liaises with the other agencies that may need access and says, okay, we're granting Department of Agriculture user credentials for these people to be able to access the system. Department of Taxation has these people. Some states, they mentioned, certain law enforcement agencies had access to, their system. But it's basically, what that primary regulator was doing is they're looking for inversion, diversion, making sure they are able to account for all the product all the way from cultivation through retail sales.
So they're not just the system owner, they're the enforcer as well. I mean, they're the ones that would, if something seemed to be a scam where, I guess if you find something in a retail environment that doesn't have that track all the way back to the seedling, it's that primary regulator that would be the one that would issue that violation or handle that.
I mean, in those two states that we spoke to, that's what it seemed to be, was that they, yes.
I just wanted to chime in from the medical side because we already have a seed to sale process that is mandated in the medical cannabis program. And I just want to add some commentary there around making sure that medical and adult use can be on the same platform for consistency in reporting and ease of operations. And also, like many of the platforms we use, not just to have our auditable seed to sale tracking, but like we use that to keep track of how our plants are performing and assess, canopy space, and are we keeping up with patient demand in a medical program, customer demand in an adult use program. So while there's lots to be done on the regulator side, it is also a management tool for the businesses as well.
Yeah, that was. We also had a conversation with one of the providers of software, and they mentioned that many states and many growers or many licensees from the grower all the way to retail used for certain functionalities within those systems for those purposes.
Charles Green, Michael Carter. And maybe this is just curious how you acquire your initial seeds, being that it is a legal substance. I know with hemp, we were getting seeds from all over the country, if not the world. Is that the same possibility?
Every state that we've spoken to, we've asked that question, and every answer has been immaculate conception. So the initial seeds appeared miraculously in the state with the first growers that were established.
I got you. Total faith. I got you.
You do. I guess you don't have a tracking system yet, since you don't have seeds, right? So then the seeds generate the tracking system. They're just there.
Yeah, I mean, just did specifically ask that question because of, but many of the states pointed to the Cole memorandum and, kind of federal government stance of, the program is supposed to be a completely hermetically sealed, state. And so nothing can come in and out. And that even includes from the very beginning. So the first seedlings and seeds just appeared.
That's how our medical cannabis program works.
Mr. Green, Moran here. The seed to sale regulation, is it the purpose of that? Is it quality control for THC levels or is it actually to track the various taxation points, manufacturing, distribution, wholesale? I mean, could you give me a little bit of why seed to sale is so appears to be important in those two states?
I mean, my sense was that it's really more materials tracking. So it's inventory tracking of the cannabis material. And at every point, so, when the initial seedlings get an RFID or a barcode, they move on to harvest and trimming. And, that trimmer they input the plant that they're trimming, and they will type into the system how much material, usable material they got out of it, and how much was sort of waste or trim. And then that usable material kind of goes on with another RFID tag to the next stage. And it really was, I think really was about the two things, was looking for any anomalies that would show inversion or diversion of product. And then lastly, three things: inversion, diversion, making sure that everything's taxed at wherever level, the state is assessing the tax. And then the third thing was, and by when I say quality control, I really mean more control of adulterants or other things that you don't want in the product. So if a product is tested at the retail level or there's a consumer complaint and the state investigates and find, oh, this has got heavy metals in it, that it's pretty easy for the state to then go back through the chain of custody and figure out who or where in that process was something introduced that should not have been introduced.
I'll insert myself in here again too. I think it's seed to sale fundamentally has its roots in federal prohibition and in the fact that any company that was trying to participate in a state legal market needed to actively show every step of the way that they were not engaging in any sort of criminal enterprise. Because if they were, obviously licenses would be revoked, businesses would end, things like that. But it's also used because it does go all the way from cultivation. So the moment a plant is 6 inches high, it's getting tagged, and that tag follows it from when it is a 6-inch tall seedling all the way through trim. If it becomes an oil, those oils will get labeled. It's also important that Charles just mentioned when it comes to testing remediation, depending on what type of product it is. For oil-based products in particular, if we have a contaminant show up in testing, being able to track it enables us to both isolate where a problem was, and also if we can do another round of processing, or if there's an option to be able to remediate, the testing levels in order to not have to throw out an entire product batch, but to instead reprocess and make sure that a product is meeting that testing standard. It enables that process in addition to recall process. Those systems, though, are also used at the point of sale. So it's taxed at every level in terms of whatever it is that needs to be tracked, weight, units, and things like that. But even at the point of sale, I mean, that's also getting into the things for Columbia Care, for example. We run a program called Adopt a Family, where we provide subsidies to medical cannabis patients who would qualify for Medicaid or otherwise below a certain income level or things like that. And we have to introduce that through the point of sale system in order to account for every dollar that is being brought and spent in our companies and in our facilities. So it really is, while people have come to use that in order to do various types of product management, the fundamental purpose of seed to sale systems has been to ensure maintaining federal legality by not violating any sort of interstate commerce or being a part of illicit activity and being able to demonstrate it. So I would say I think it's also important because from a company standpoint, those things are really important for us because they make sure we can clearly demonstrate to our regulators that we are complying with the law and that we are working to be good corporate citizens wherever we're operating.
Thank you for that. Did we have any more questions for Charles? Thank you, Charles, for that very thorough overview of Colorado and Oregon. And we talked a lot about that seed to sale tracking system. And so appreciate you providing some extra detail around that as well. Thank you. So we have some time for a little bit of subgroup discussion. And, I was just thinking, I would imagine our role as members of this subgroup at some point will be to make some recommendations around the structure of what this program could look like and the fiscal implications. And with that in mind, I began to think about maybe opening up for some discussion around some common themes that you've been hearing from other states, or maybe some considerations that we need to really focus on or could be important as we make decisions here in Virginia about establishing a program and what that program could look like. And I think specifically to what I'm considering some lessons learned as we've talked to other states about, for example, one of the things that Charles mentioned in his presentation was the consideration around upfront funding and FTEs established through the General Assembly to get the program going, as opposed to trying to develop a program relying on fees and taxes and et cetera. Those are things that we need to think about in terms of recommendations we'll make for what could work well in Virginia. So also maybe we could consider some things that this subcommittee may need to know a little bit more about, that we may have heard a little bit about, but would like to know more that other states didn't share. So just wanted to open up the floor for maybe some conversations about some considerations and things that will be important as we move forward with recommendations from our subcommittee.
Jen Michelle Padini, I certainly agree with the need to have legislative considerations for FTEs. Many members here will recall that our medical program was started without any funding by the state, and has been, that's presented an incredible challenge. And to that point, I think the primary consideration that we as a group should make is how to incorporate and accommodate our existing regulatory structure. It is very good to learn lessons from other states, but we cannot overlook that we already have our own experience with this here, and that is that is our real world experience here in the Commonwealth.
I feel like I talk a lot at these, so trying to make sure I create space for others. But I want to add a few things. I think one, I wanted to flag that while we got a little bit on social equity in the scope of this conversation, and I think the social equity structural issues, or social equity is both relevant to this fiscal and structural setup, as well as for the legal and regulatory setup in particular, when we look at the different models out there for bringing in social equity applicants, and how, for example, with the Board of Pharmacy, the program was started without a new budget, which meant that there were pretty steep fees to just submit an application. And one of the first steps to creating a path for social equity ownership is addressing the fees for applications, as well as the other things around access to capital and things like that. And so just want to raise that as something that we should perhaps do another deeper dive into in terms of how social equity programs might be impacting revenue projections, and how to structure something that can adequately support aspiring entrepreneurs in entering a very difficult and highly regulated field. The other piece, when it comes to some of that initial year establishment and initial funding, is looking at some of the models around using the existing medical industry to levy fees in order to have access to participation in adult use, in order to cover the costs of those initial FTEs. I think we saw some good clarity around annual budgets for the regulatory staff it takes to not just build, but then enforce the rules, not just build a program, but also enforce the rules. But I'm curious about what those initial costs might be for year one, when you don't necessarily have any enterprises that you have to be doing spot checks on, and you're just trying to build the application process, and what fees can be levied off of existing operators in order to support that. The additional thing that I'll just, while I'm on a roll here, is also looking at some of the social equity models that can help reduce barriers to capital in Colorado and in, I believe, San Francisco, because in California, social equity is done at a local level, not at the state level. They have created incubation programs where folks can identify themselves as a qualified social equity applicant, and existing industry operators can identify themselves as a potential incubator. And that can also help facilitate easier access to capital by creating some of these partnerships between existing enterprises. It also helps folks get up and running more quickly because they have access to skilled know-how and legal resources and accounting resources that, again, you can find a lot of lawyers, but there aren't that many cannabis lawyers for Virginia at the moment. And similarly with accountants, you actually have to find a very specific cannabis trained accountant because of the challenges around federal 280E, which would be the last thing I bring up, is looking at tax structures and trying to account for the issues with and extreme challenges with federal 280E, and how some of those problems can be addressed at the state level. in ways that ensure a more robust industry. I know we've seen a lot around different tax rates and things like that, but I do think that there are some important lessons learned from states that came out too early with extremely high tax rates that then disincentivize participation in the legal industry, and that ramping up those tax rates can be tricky, especially for Virginia. We are right next to DC, which has a very large gray market presence that already impacts Northern Virginia.
And Gist, if I recall, just going back to the social equity discussion, did you mention Illinois as a state that had established some good programming in that area? I mean, who had done a lot around social equity?
Yeah, I did. There's also the Minority Cannabis Business Association. I did reach out to Toy Hutchinson with Brad's assistance, and she was unfortunately not available at this time. And so if we are open to, I would love to be able to invite Toy Hutchinson or somebody else from the Illinois cannabis program to present on the program they did and what lessons they're learning, because it is very much still coming online, as well as the executive director for the Minority Cannabis Business Association.
Yeah, this is Travis Hill, and I would definitely support that conversation. I think one of the things we have to figure out is, you know, even defining what's covered in social equity. How do we make sure that we address all the issues that are out there? You know, impacts on communities that this had previously, and then how do we make sure that people can participate? But then, I mean, what comes to mind for me, again, from my alcohol background, if there's a prohibition, if you're convicted of a felony, you can't hold an ABC license. Well, we've had cases where, you know, the moonshiner says, hey, the one thing I really do well in life is making moonshine, but I got caught. I want to get legal. Can I get a license? And we say, no, you can't get a license because you convicted of a felony. And so it becomes cyclical in a way where somebody says, hey, I want to get legal, but then we create this bar. And I think we need to be careful going into this environment that we acknowledge those types of impacts.
I would agree. And I think the other piece too, from a fiscal standpoint, is where does tax revenue go? Illinois created the R3 reinvestment fund because I probably said it once already to this group, and you'll hear me say it again. The people impacted by cannabis prohibition weren't just future cannabis entrepreneurs. They were graphic designers and restaurateurs and all kinds of folks who had all kinds of dreams. And equity within the cannabis industry is absolutely a critical piece, but finding ways to be reinvesting in those communities and defining and understanding what tools and resources we can be making available to help restore those harms.
Joe, I had also a question for Jen. When you referenced current existing regulatory structures, Jen, were you talking about what we do currently for medical, or is it kind of the regulatory structure, culture writ large in Virginia? And I come from a place of ignorance when it comes to what medical marijuana regulation looks like in Virginia. And maybe those of you who are more informed, maybe you can just give me a private tutorial on it versus you're taking other people's time. But I know I would benefit to understand what are the structures in place now, because I have almost zero knowledge of that. And I agree, you know, let's if at all possible, build on the learnings we've already experienced, since this is something that's running now.
Certainly, Travis, right. So I was specifically speaking to medical cannabis, though certainly we have the regulatory model specific to industrial hemp through VDACs. And ultimately, you know, we could theoretically have 3 cannabis silos: adult use, medical, and industrial hemp. And we certainly don't want to have to legislate pathways between these silos anytime they want to interact. Ideally, we're looking at establishing some sort of cannabinoid ecosystem, some umbrella agency or agency that in which these 3 can operate and can collaborate. And so we do have those existing silos that we should take a look at, you know, how they're structured and how they can roll into this ecosystem, hopefully. That's what I was speaking to specifically. You know, Dr. Brown probably has some additional insights as it relates to Board of Pharmacy, and I'm sure Nigist or other members of the processors who are here would have some thoughts to share on that as well.
Yeah, and Travis, this is David Brown at the Department of Health Professions, and I'd be glad to next week maybe you and I can have a phone call. I can catch you up on our farmer farm. With Jen's earlier comment, I think we want something that embraces the reality of English device language silos. So I don't think we need to spend time on it now, but I'll shoot you an email and we can make sure you have a good understanding of what the current landscape looks like.
Thank you.
Brad, I had a question, and it's kind of more of a process question, and I don't know if you know the answer to this question, but in terms of our feedback and whatever it is that we're supposed to create at the end of this process, do you envision that we would be recommending a specific type of structure, or if we would be maybe recommending some structural options that could be utilized and the decision could be made at a higher level? What is kind of the feel of what we need to think about in terms of our recommendations?
That's a great question. And honestly, I think it could go either way. I think if we are in this process and, in these discussions, we realize that we really do feel like there is a structure that is going to work best for Virginia. I think we can call that out. But I do also think that kind of in this role as an advisory work group to the General Assembly, who's going to be making this final decision in the coming few months about whether to actually move forward on this, I think presenting some options would also be really good for them.
Thank you.
To sort of follow up to Brad's point there, I think that it would be helpful for this work group, to potentially the entire work group, if not just specifically this subgroup, to at least be briefed by JLARC as they are exploring a number of the considerations that this subgroup in particular is trying to take a look at. And, we don't need to reinvent the wheel, essentially.
Yeah, and thanks, Jim Michelle. We had some conversations with them way back at the beginning of this process, but haven't followed up yet. So we definitely need to do that. So appreciate you bringing that up, and also appreciate you making that connection for me this week.
And Jewel, to circle back to something you had mentioned earlier regarding Illinois, that is one of the states, as it relates to restorative justice opportunities within adult use, that is called out specifically in the JLARC provisions.
Thanks for that. Brad, I didn't know if you wanted to talk about kind of what our next step or action would be of the subgroup going forward, and then we can think about that.
Yeah, sure thing. So our next full group meeting is going to be next Wednesday, the 16th. We are going to do that at 9:30 again, like we did our first meeting. And we'll have a couple more presentations that are going to be much broader, more broadly focused, and some folks that are playing on the national level that are going to talk through some additional items about. And then at that work group meeting, we'll also have kind of reports from each of our subgroups, kind of on the progress that each group has made as a midpoint check-in, knowing that there's a lot of work to do. I think that there seems to be a demand for some additional getting additional input from other experts. So we can talk about, I think, maybe having another meeting similar to this where we have invite a couple more folks to come in and talk to us. But no, keeping in mind that, you know, we're on a pretty tight schedule. So our plan is to try to, we have the minutes from our first meeting, and we'll have minutes from this meeting along with the presentations and everything that was shared today. And we'll try to get that put together relatively quickly so we can have it for discussion for everyone to see at the full group meeting on Wednesday. So we'll get that done. And then other than that, I think it's really going to be up to the work group to think about kind of how we feel about our progress. You know, we on staff have a lot of good information that, you know, we can go ahead and start framing out kind of the bones of a report. That's something that we've already started thinking about. But just as we go throughout this process, as we learn information and talk to additional resources, we can start kind of putting meat on those bones. So, you know, I think it's, again, this is a kind of a work group driven process. So as you all feel we need additional information or additional folks to hear from, just let us know. If you feel like, you know, there's an additional topic that we need to cover, let us know. A lot of you have been really great about sending us ideas already of topics, both topics and the speakers. A lot of you were very helpful in actually making the connections for us and getting speakers for this meeting and our meetings, the other subgroups on Monday. So let's, I think, just keep it up. I think we feel good from the governor's office about the place that we're at, and really appreciate everyone's hard work so far.
Thank you for that. Appreciate that. Do we have any other items that anyone wants to bring up or discuss, or any other information that we need or points of discussion?
A question that it might be out of this work group. So that's my first question. Is it us, or is it maybe the law regulatory? Because it came up a couple times today about just the status of the enforcement agents. Are they sworn law enforcement? Are they non-sworn law enforcement? What are their powers and duties? Or is it limited to marijuana? Is it across the board? Is that something we need to be aware of, or is that something that's sitting over the legal regulatory side? And so we're not really looking at the personnel sitting in whatever agency or entity houses this.
Travis, I feel like that is something, and one of my colleagues from the governor's office, or Secretary Moran, if you want to jump in on this, I think this is something that both subgroups will need to have some discussion about, because in my mind, the responsibilities of the enforcement agents are kind of a separate conversation, but relate directly to whether or not they will fit into whatever agency we set up, whatever organizational structure. So we'll kind of have to be talking about that simultaneously. And I think it's going to be a really important discussion for us to have. And the more I've heard from other states about the complex issues that they've been through in kind of setting up their enforcement programs, the more I'm realizing that we really need to be having those kind of deep dive discussions.
So we have about 5 or 6 minutes left, and I know that we have to reserve some time for public comment. So if there are no other pressing questions, Brad, I would open it up, I guess, or you can open it up for any public comments.
Sure. Thanks, Jewel. So we had 3 folks that were pre-registered to do public comment, and I'm going to do this in the order that you registered. So our public, the way this is going to work is I'm going to call out these folks first of all, and then if there are any additional people, you can use the raise hand function or send me a message in the chat. Or if you're calling in, we have a couple folks who have called in, just hit *3 and I'll get a notification that you'd like to provide comment. So the person that we have, and we have 2 minutes on the clock for each person, is Kay Hamlin from the Hemp Research Group. So I'm going to unmute you, Kay.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you for the organizers of the call. Joel Branow, I appreciate you and the Commissioner's Office being instrumental in making sure that there are opportunities to have discussions like this one. The public comment I wanted to offer today is really reiterating a lot of what I heard from the states like Massachusetts and Illinois that have taken routes to legalization that are not ballot box initiatives, but have been driven more by executive government or legislation. Those are the models that I think most resemble what is possible. And to the point that there was that the challenges related to equity have been noted and discussed on this call, I really would implore the commissioners of agriculture and all of the other cross-sector groups that are going to have to get involved to look more closely at those models. I was delighted to hear, and I just want to reiterate that vertical structures are basically create the greatest barriers to entry. And I hope that the considerations of those models are low on the list, that as Virginia expands, we begin to look more like, again, some of those other states that have taken legislative and executive paths to legalization. I just, lastly, in closing, want to ask a question that can be answered offline, or if someone has the answers today, I'd be interested to know how many of the counties and cities in Virginia are on the list of 29 that have been researched or evaluated as being most impacted. And lastly, I would also say that Virginia is in a very good position to build on what's been done already, what works. And it looks like there is a lot of work that can be done at the local level, a lot of direction that can be provided because of the way that the Dillon Rule functions in our state. There's a lot of leadership and guidance that can be provided to the localities around establishing community agreements, the importance of that, and pathways to getting it done. Lastly, my last comment is that as we move forward, I did hear a lot of things about equity, social equity applicants and applications. I would implore the state, the Commonwealth, to really look for solutions to what I heard is the catch-22. Right now, there are 800 people who have participated in agribusiness programs through the Department of Corrections. The Department of Corrections has been receiving money for agribusiness, and I would implore that that money be continued to that money continue to be used to help this effort in ways that you are going to need FTEs. And lastly, that those 800 people who have been in the agribusiness programs in the Department of Corrections who have already expressed an interest in agribusiness be given priority.
Thank you, Kay. The next person that I had on my list is Leroy Hardy, and I don't see Mr. Hardy from Hardy Family Farms on anymore. He was on earlier, but we may have lost him. I'll see if we can get him back if he's still interested. And then the third person on our list is Michael Crowitz, and I have to apologize, first of all, to Michael. At our first subgroup meeting, I didn't see him in time. He was sending me a message to do public comment. So he is going to present something, present what he was going to say at our last meeting and today, and then he has something that something to include in our minutes as well. But I want to apologize to him and say welcome to Michael.
Thank you so much. Hopefully you can hear me. I'll go ahead and read this, get this little statement that I was going to just submit, put in the minutes from last week, but just a couple minutes, I'll go ahead and read it to you. But thank you so much, members of the subgroup. You paying very close attention to these meetings. I really thank you for your thoughtful deliberations. Again, my name is Michael Crowitz. I'm Executive Director of Veterans for Medical Cannabis Access. a national veterans all-volunteer service organization. Together with MVETS, we're engaging this process now before the Virginia legislature. We have also been working to engage the Virginia Department of Veterans Services. Our organization does its best to represent the needs of more than 750,000 military veterans living here in Virginia, and is credited for negotiating the first ever Veterans Affairs National Medical Cannabis Veterans Health Administration policy back in 2010. And since then, we've been working on coinciding state laws. Virginia's military veterans face unique challenges as their Veterans Affairs doctors are still under federal orders not to fill out any forms for veterans to participate in state medical cannabis programs. And we have found many veterans grow their own at home or wait for full adult regulated access so that they can buy their cannabis without being part of a database or having to hire a doctor outside of the veterans health system. Veterans often live on a fixed income, and it is a burden to pay for duplicative medical services and registrations in addition to the cost of the cannabis itself. Veterans need to be reassured that using cannabis under your state medical program and under your state legalization marijuana program will not result in loss of benefits. This is the veterans' greatest concern that we've heard, loss of benefits such as financial compensation. These benefits are protected by current federal VHA policy, the one we won back in 2010, but the VA doesn't really promote that policy. Veterans will be amongst those transitioning from what we're calling the traditional or illegal marijuana market to the legal market. In other states, we have military veterans participating in every level of this emerging industry, from the farmers all the way to the venture capitalists. We're disappointed a little bit that we weren't able to get a veterans representative on the bill that created this working group, since our concerns are systemic, and will be hard to represent as a meeting observer. For this reason, we really ask you, dear members of the subgroup and of the entire working group, to include our Veterans Cannabis working group in these discussions as much as possible as we move forward. To summarize, cannabis is still illegal under federal law, so possession on federal property is crime, despite state decriminalization. Widely held fears that using cannabis under state program will result in loss of VA benefits, considerations to ensure veterans are able to work and get good jobs in this emerging industry, and the need for policy that considers these factors, as well as those arising around the active duty military, are all subjects of our concern. And really, please consider our organization a supportive resource moving forward. And from today, just to add to this, a very, very short comment that it's really something that we've seen that's very helpful to workplace job protection. Again, because of the federal versus state interaction, this protections that would normally not really be needed need to be put in place. I think we're all in agreement that you can't drive under the influence of drugs, including marijuana, and you can't have drug use interfere with your job, even if it's legal. And that is something that we can create a good standard and actually be supportive of those that were just using marijuana legal under state law and were snared in a drug test at some point because of the fact marijuana sticks around in your body for so long. So thanks again, everyone, and really do appreciate your very obvious, thoughtful deliberation.
Great. Thank you, Michael. And that's everyone that I have on our list of pre-registered folks, and I don't see anyone else with their hand raised, or I don't have any other messages in the chat. So maybe one last call for additional public comment if anyone else is interested. Okay, Dr. Bernal and Travis, I think that's everyone.
All righty. Travis, do you want to adjourn us today?
Do I have to move anything, or are we just hereby adjourned?
I think we can just be adjourned.
Yes.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care.